Okay, everybody, let's kick off. Welcome to this first strand in the history session. My name's James Panton, and far more interesting than that is that sat beside me is Josie Appleton, and I'm delighted to introduce Josie on this subject, the death of Socrates and the birth of the individual, the birth of individual morality. Josie may well be known to some of you, indeed many of you, for her work as a political campaigner. She is the co-founder and director of the Manifesto Club, which campaigns against the hyper-regulation of everyday life, and she's been involved in some pretty important, I think, and high-profile campaigns against the growth of regulation in our everyday and interpersonal relationships, everything from the vetting of adults who work with children through to bans on photographs within school to campaigns against on-the-spot fines and numerous other things. Josie is also, I think, a journalist and an essayist who consistently brings a level of kind of intellectual rigour but actually creative insight to a reading of contemporary society. And I think what we're going to get an example of today, well, I hope, Josie, I don't want to set you up for a fall, but I hope what we're going to get an example of today is the fact that much of the insight that she brings to her campaigning work and her essays about what's going on in the contemporary world is drawn from her reading of some of the great thinkers and ideas in the history of philosophy. So there you go, I have set you up with a high bar to fill, Josie. Do you want to, I'll get my pen ready to take notes and insights while you give us some insights for the next 40 minutes. Josie.
Thanks, Jim. As a civil liberties campaigner, I suppose I might be expected to talk about the trial of Socrates as one of the battle for free speech, the individual conscience against the community. But I'm not really going to take that perspective. When Socrates was tried on the charges of denying the gods, introducing new gods and corrupting the youth, and convicted to die, I think that really what you see enacted here in a very dramatic manner and captured amazingly by Plato is the conflict between two opposing principles, two opposing models of morality, and the idea of how one decides on a good life and conducts oneself. And I think that is between individual morality and customary morality. That is the difference between the individual who reflects and discovers the good for himself and how one should live for himself, and that of customary morality, where the models are essentially there in social life and one adopts them and assumes them and follows them. And I think in looking at this trial, people tend to take one side or the other. They tend to say, I'm on the side of Socrates, I'm for individual conscience, I'm for free speech, I'm against the community. Or they say, I'm on the side of Athens, on the side of the jury. Socrates, he defied morality, he undermined the generally accepted ways of doing things, and to no end. And so people sort of they tend to write a prosecution speech or a defence speech, take one side or the other. I think that Hegel's approach allows us to move beyond that and to see it conflict not between right on one side and wrong on the other, but to see the moment as a turning point and the emergence of a new principle. And in that turning point, there is right and truth on both sides. So in a way, there is right on the side of Socrates and also right on the side of the jury who convicted him to die. To start with, I think we need to outline the nature of Athenian customary morality, because it's not like the customary morality of China or Sparta, a society where essentially you have forms of doing things, forms of ethics where mores are stamped on the individual. The individual is bashed into shape by society. They're drilled. In China, they're beaten with a bamboo. In Sparta, the child is torn away from their parents and raised in state nurseries and disciplined. So in these societies, essentially, morality is the product of society stamping itself on the individual. Athens is very different, has a very different form of morality, which is, it contains individuality within it. It's based on individuals being spontaneously and committing to the ideals of the city. So Sparta throws itself into battle because they've been disciplined and drilled to do so. The Athenians throw themselves into battle because they're of their own volition seeking honour and esteem they're seeking to offer the best of themselves to the city. So essentially the customary morality is developed spontaneously through individuals seeking to develop themselves and display themselves. And yet, the way in which individuals display themselves, those ways are essentially found in communal life. So the idea of what it means to be a brave person, what it means to be a good person, in a way those are found ready-made for the individual in the institutions of the time, in the models for conduct, and essentially in the social life itself. And Pericles is very much the model of this. And he says essentially that it means offering the good life is offering personal excellence to the city. So I think in the period of High Athens, so the kind of mid-5th century, is a period where you see that the individual and the collective life in balance. And so you have a collective life which is incredibly intense and vibrant, but it develops through spontaneous individual commitments. So people writing great works and striving to win at athletics and be brave in battle. And you have a period where those two things are perfectly in balance and there's no contradiction there. But the individual in that situation is not yet conscious of himself. He's very much immersed in the collective life of the city and not conscious of being something apart from that or reflective back on that. And to some extent, the energy of mid-century Athens comes from that lack of consciousness, the fact that people don't agonize about what the right thing to do is. One classicist said that they were able to devote themselves fully to the business of living because there was a lack of existential anxiety. They were at ease and at home in the world. So this is the portrait of Greek customary morality that Socrates was questioning. And so what you see with Socrates is therefore that it's not that it's a development out of Athenian culture. So it's a development of one side of something that was already in Athens. So the spontaneous individual who sought to compete and display and fight for the city. Essentially, Socrates moves out of that and becomes critical, reflective of it. But I think the key point is that it's a development out of Athenian society and not something entirely different. So in terms of the charges against him, there were two elements, I think, to Socrates' innovation and his discovering of individual morality. And they're relatively separate. They appear as relatively separate principles. I think the first one is that through individual reasoning you find what virtue is. You find the kind of right orientation for conduct. So customary morality, the idea of you find conduct in ethical life, it's immanent in the social world. It's in common assumptions, in myths, in the heroes, in the social institutions, in the laws. And so it's about the unconscious categories of social practice, notions of good, what it means to be brave, to develop oneself. And so the individual finds those and adopts them. Against this, Socrates finds ethical models in the individual reasoning process, which we see exhibited in Plato's dialogue. So the model of a dialogue is Socrates says, what is bravery, temperance, piety? What is some form of virtue? The answer is given, it means standing firm in battle or being quiet. And then he asks a series of questions which essentially lead to contradictory statements. And then the person suggests a new answer. Well, actually, it's about firmness of soul. And then he asks some more questions. And then at the end, the person storms off, or they say, I don't know what I'm talking about anymore. I feel distressed and at loss for definitions. I feel like I've been stung by a stingfish. There's a kind of, that's not a word, but it's a rough translation from the Greek. So essentially the person then ends up annoyed or distressed. And that's a kind of basic model. And I think really what this basic model is about is it's a conscious deconstruction of the customary morality of the time, but as a kind of exhibition, as a performance. So he starts with a question, and the answer is always what most people think that thing is, so what most people think bravery is. And he takes it apart, and the exhibition is to show that most people do not know what they think they know. And yet the point of this is not to say that we can never know it, but it's very much about the search for universal definition. He is genuinely searching for the meaning of temperance, the meaning of bravery. And this really represents an attempt to build moral categories anew out of the reasoning process. So to take apart the forms of the social world and to build up again out of individual thought alone. So in these terms, morality is a clear idea, it's a clear concept, reached through individual reasoning. And the aim of the definition is to replace the concepts found immanently in social life, in institutions. So the definition of an object, so the definition provides an object-like firmness towards which conduct can be oriented. So it's very much against the intuitive, the unconscious, the things that you think you know. The idea is to have a definition that, through its clarity, through the power of cognition, would therefore be constructive of moral conduct. And this represents a key stage on from the sophists, which he and Plato were extremely hostile towards and spent a long time very much sparring with. Socrates very much built off what the sophists were doing, but he's doing something quite different. So the sophists said, they turned also against the forms of customary morality, and they said, law's a convention, it's just a contract. We could easily invent or draw up alternative laws. The sophists were essentially about the power of thoughts to determine reality, both natural reality and social reality. And so reality then appears as contingent. It's like, well, yes, we think this, but we could easily think the other. The sophists were also about the pursuit of individual interests in the public sphere. So they, most famously about the teaching of rhetoric. So in a way they were saying, yes, all laws are made, we make up all laws, we could make them up easily a different way. So we may as well just pursue our own interests and try and win the laws that suit ourselves as individuals. So really they were out, on the one hand, a kind of relativism, and on the other hand, a kind of self-interested pursuit. Socrates is a development on from this, because he doesn't merely show up customary morality as null, but he re-founds morality on a new basis. He's seeking the universal in a new place, which is in the reasoning process of the individual. So he's seeking the universal truth rather than showing that there is no truth. And yet, although he's the appearance of this new principle, it's very much in a nascent form, in its first, earliest form. And so this is the source of some of the criticisms made by Izzy Stone in the book I recommend on the reading list. He says, Socrates, it's a metaphysical wild goose chase. He's asking futile questions, making people look stupid, denying what everybody thinks and what everybody knows already. So, and this is true in a certain sense, but these are the features of a new idea appearing in its earliest, most nascent form. And what happens when a new idea appears? It doesn't appear fully in the most developed form, ready to be put into action immediately. It appears, first of all, largely in a negative form. It appears set against a previous assumption. So Socrates didn't go off on his own and reflect like Descartes in the oven. He was all the time in public. And what he was very much that he was intimately tied to civic life. What he was doing was taking apart what other people think. He was very much, he was a negation of that. And he's himself put forward no positive form. That's the whole kind of Socratic irony or Socratic ignorance. So he didn't actually say what I think. He took apart what other people think. And he calls himself a midwife. He says, I bring forth nothing myself, but I am led others to bring forth themselves. So I think really what this is about is acting out in relation to another person, an intellectual process that will later be conducted internally. So Socrates negation of the other, essentially he's pricking the other person to question their beliefs and to think, what do they really know? Later, that would be within the individual, within the person asking themselves what they really know. But with Socrates, it's still in its negative form. What is he for? It's not customary morality. It's not that much he knows. It's not in a positive form of actually it's this other thing. It's still very much not that. And it's very much a case that the universal definition is never reached. So the end of the dialogue doesn't have this answer of what is bravery or temperance or anything else. It's very much the idea of that universal morality and not the reality of it, not the content. And in many ways, what it's about, or what is achieved, is merely the individual consciousness of their own reasoning process. So Socrates says, people think they know, but they do not know. I am wiser in the small detail that I know that I do not know. And that small detail was really only about the conscious awareness of one's own reasoning process, which is realized first only in the negative form, I know that I do not know. And what he sees as the virtue of being entirely distressed for true definitions, searching for the truth, and just the morality of that task in itself, regardless of whether one achieves it or not. So that's the first element of Socrates in terms of the individual reasoning process, the deconstruction of customary morality through the process of questioning, and the search for universal definitions which would replace that morality. So the search for an idea which would replace the models that are latent in social institutions. That's the first element. The second element is quite separate, which is his genius, his inner God. Now this was a voice or a sign that appeared to him, and it appeared at moments when he was about to make a decision, such as he was about to cross the river, it warned him not to cross the river. He was about to get up, it warned him not to get up. Essentially, it was very practical. And so in everyday conduct, it said, it warned him when he was about to do something and said, it's advantageous for you not to do that. But he experienced this as a voice in his head. And what this represents is a development out of the system of oracles in Athens, where the system whereby leaders, ordinary people, would consult to see whether they should carry out a particular form of action, whether they should build a house in this place or that, whether they should launch a battle now or later. And they would read signs of the moon, the rustling of leaves, the rustling of streams, the utterances of the oracles in the temples. So essentially, in areas where there is uncertainty, where they didn't know what to do, they would essentially consult signs in the external world. And it was to disastrous effect often, to the extent that battles were lost because of the moon. Socrates' genius performed the same role as an oracle, in the sense that it's practical advice that he's talking about. It's not about right or wrong or morality, it's very much advantageous conduct. Should I do this or that? But it was a revolutionary step that essentially he'd internalized the oracle in his own head, and that it appears as his own voice, only to him, in his inner world. This is something that would later develop into conscience, in the sense that a person asks themselves, what should I do in this situation? You talk to yourself in your own voice. It's the first form of it, so it's very much in a limited form. It's as a voice of a god, it's something that just appears, and it's something that's very practical. It's not to do with ethics, it's entirely separated from ethics. But still, it's a revolutionary step to have that within the individual and not in the social world. So those are the two elements, I think, that are important about Socrates' challenge to customary morality. They're also the two elements that were key to his trial and conviction. So the accusation of the trial that he denied the gods and he introduced new gods. Xenophon, who's one of the documenters of Socrates, says it's not a big deal. Socrates' genius, it doesn't matter. It's just like an oracle, really. He sacrifices all the time. He believes in the gods. It's not a big deal. But it is a big deal because essentially what it does is it undermines the social institutions and the ways in which people's conduct were guided. To have a voice in your own head telling you what to do, rather than to, through socially established mechanisms, be reading forms of omen, is a revolutionary step, and that's fundamentally undermining of that kind of that system. Everybody hearing voices in their heads, what would that have done? So I think what we see in the trial, and in Plato's account of the trial, is the dramatization of these two principles of coming into conflict, of customary morality, the morality of the city, and individual morality, the morality of the questioning critical individual. And this is very different from other impiety trials, where various philosophers proposed ideas that were critical of religion or critical of kind of state law. But in those cases, in those previous trials, neither side forced the issue. So it wasn't actually terribly serious. The offending person did a deal. They escaped through their friends, or they managed to kind of pay off and get banishment or something like that. But essentially, nobody forced the issue. Socrates is the first person to have forced the issue, and the city facing him in the jury was the first time that they forced the issue too. So very much these two things came into conflict with the death of one party in this conflict. So people tend to, in looking at this trial, as I said, see writers lying on one side or the other. But I think the Hegelian approach is to see these as not two opposing ideas, right or wrong, but as a turning point, the introduction of a new principle, which is the negation of the old principle. But they're both, first of all, necessary in a stage of development of human consciousness. They're way markers, and they're both necessary in the kind of coming to consciousness and self-knowledge. And secondly, actually, that they're both right in a certain way. There is truth. The jury was right in certain ways. Certain parts of his accusation were correct. And Socrates was right in certain ways. Certain parts of his defense were correct. And that's because the way that a new principle or idea appears is it appears in too extreme a form. It rejects, in a kind of carte blanche way, all the elements of the old form. So Socrates turns against all the institutions, all the laws, and says, I find the truth only in my powers of reasoning. That's all. Not in emotion, not in what other people think, but only in my own head and my own reasoning. And what you see is later the reintroduction of some of the things he rejected, and the inclusion of his insights as well. So with Aristotle in the lecture we've just heard, a much more nuanced notion. Aristotle, he considers what other people think about things, but in a critical manner. So he's able to consider general mores and laws without being immersed in them or being taken over by them. He can stand outside of them. And he can stand outside of them because of Socrates, who was the first person to stand outside of them. So in a way, in that kind of movement of consciousness, you get a rejection of something which is too extreme, such that later you then go back to the original insight. So the idea that ethics is in the community, for example, was rejected and said, no, it's all in individual reasoning. But actually then you go back to the role of society and education and morality in later forms. So first of all, there was validity and nobility in his defense. And you can see this as very much the exhibition of the principle of individual morality. And he says, he defies the court, he defies their judgment. He stands against them and says, I will obey God rather than you. I'm not going to do what you say. And there's a way in which his defiance of the court is the realization and consummation of what he's been doing. He says, all my life I've been preparing to defend myself. It's very much, this is his great drama, the moment in which he can, in a full sense, exhibit the principle that he's been seeking. So he defies the court. He refuses to give an ordinary speech, to plead and beg and bring his crying children. And he says, I'm not going to give the kind of speech you like to hear. I'm not going to do what most people do before you, even Pericles, to beg and to essentially say, please forgive me, please let me go. He refuses to beg, and he's unashamed. So he uses the court not to apologise, but to justify himself. And he says, my activities are the real public good, not what you think, but what I do. The real civic duty is not to follow orders, but to prick others into consciousness. And it's this conscious questioning, rather than the unconscious following of laws, that's the genuine civic duty, the genuine universal. And against that, he says, what you think, it's a lazy, blurry untruth. So it's a defense of himself and saying, my way is right and it's the future. And then, after the guilty verdict, he refuses to accept the judgment. So then, what's having the guilty verdict, he's supposed to propose his alternative punishment to the death penalty. So he's supposed to say a fine, exile, something like that, something that accepts that what I did was wrong, but don't be too hard on me, basically. At that point, he, instead of doing the usual thing, he suggests punishments that, well, first of all, he suggests he be kept at the public expense for life. And then he suggests some derisory fine after his friends have suggested that might be an advantageous course of action. But essentially, the amount he suggests is such an insult that it's even worse. Even worse. He's not complicit in his own punishment. He doesn't accept the judgment. He's saying basically, I'm certain of myself, and I don't accept your judgment of me. The city is not the judge of the good. And to some extent, you could say this was disrespectful, and certainly a lot of the commentators of the trial said that he seemed rude, puffed up, arrogant. But because it comes from his own sense of a different principle, it's not simply rudeness, but has a kind of underlying basis. And ultimately his defiance of the court that was the reason for his death sentence. And a greater majority of people found him guilty, convicted him to death, and found him guilty in the first place. So he managed to goad some of the people who wanted to acquit him into actually wanting to kill him. It's quite some achievement. So very much the trial is this sort of dramatisation and grand drama of the principle of individual morality. And he has right on his side. But the prosecution also has right on their side. And I think if you look at the prosecution case and also at the play by Aristophanes, The Birds, which was written 20 years before, they're kind of right. Aristophanes says, this individual questioning, it weakens the city. He talks about, the sturdy heroes of Marathon who strode to school with their legs apart, and now they're all long-haired, refutatory, disputatory, essentially a decadence, a weakening, and philosophers sitting in the corner whispering to 3 or 4 boys. They refute and deny, they suggest nothing themselves. So there's something to that. There is a truth that this new way of criticising led to a weakening of the city's ability to act in concert, and for people to be productive, strong, contributive individuals. In a literal sense, both the prosecution and the Birds are incorrect, in the sense that Socrates never performed natural experiments. He wasn't actually interested. He said, I accepted most people's accounts of lightning and everything, because he was interested in moral life, not in the natural world. So he wasn't actually interested in studying nature or saying that use doesn't exist or anything like that. But in substance, I think the allegation is correct, which is that Socrates found immorality in the individual, but in a way that at that time could produce nothing. What he was aiming at was something that at that time could not be the basis for social life or for conduct. Imagine everybody, a society organised on that basis, everybody going around hearing voices in their heads, doing what their inner gods told them to do, destroying everything that everyone else said. That would be a recipe for disaster. There's very much, with him, it's the ideal of a new universal, and not yet that reality, not yet that concrete form. And the correctness of the allegation as well, in terms of saying he corrupted the youth. Now, you could take this too far, but some of his key followers were essentially involved in some of the events that led to Athens' ruin. And you see in his followers kind of eccentricity and vanity of behaviour, which was quite extraordinary. So in terms of one follower who first of all encouraged Athens to vote for a war on Sicily, but then the night before he went, he vandalised all the statues of Hermes, which are phallic statues, but then he refused to stand trial, and then he escaped to Sparta. Basically the whole thing was a litany of reversions, switching sides, essentially somebody seeking only themselves and not any kind of greater point. So what you see really in his followers, if you actually put this into practice, if you actually think the universe is within me, what I think is right, at that time what that meant was actually a kind of craziness. And you see that too with the heretics, for example, in the 12th century. So they're defying Rome. What do? They go around ordaining themselves priests, killing themselves, a kind of eccentricity of behaviour. Basically, at that point, that idea was not yet capable of being the basis for social life or for conduct. So what you actually have when you put it into practice is only base selfishness, erratic behaviour, destructiveness. So I think, in that sense, the accusation was correct. So there you have this standoff, and yet, although both sides very much play their part to the full, so Socrates defies to the death, absolutely. The jury doesn't balk at saying, you are anathema to this city, and yet these are not opposed hostile enemies. They're very much two elements of Athenian culture at that time, and so both sides also recognise the opposing principle. It's not as if they're kind of very much in their own head and completely deny the other. They very much recognise the other as valid. So Socrates accepted his sentence. He didn't run away. In the dialogue with Crito, his friend says, "Look, I can help you escape. You can get out of here. This is what normally is done. Friends help you escape." And he says, "No." He says, "Yes, I stood my ground. I stood up for what I believe. But now I must accept the law. I will not be a destroyer of laws." And so there's a way in which, although he completely defied the law, and that was absolutely everything he was for, he also at the same time recognised the validity of law. He was summoned to court, he went. He didn't run off, he didn't defect to the Spartans. He was sentenced to death, he killed himself with his own hands. He didn't escape. So there's a way in which, although he was the absolute negation of that law, he also respected it, and ultimately through his actions, said, "This is valid too. The law is valid too." And the city also respected him, even as it convicted him to death. In some versions, it pardoned him, it put a statue up to him, and it convicted his accusers. The source of that is dubious, so it's not known that actually happened. But certainly, the city was not certain of having made the right decision. So after the trial, there was a tradition of people writing defence and prosecution speeches for the trial. The city continued to reflect on whether they'd done the right thing, and to doubt that they had. Even Aristophanes, who basically is a kind of carte blanche destruction of Socrates and what he's doing, there's a line in that where he says, "Clearly there's something on which he relies, else he'll not throw out his chest. The confidence of his bearing implies a firm base on which to rest." In that, he says, there's something on which he relies. There's a firm base on which to rest. There's something in what he says. So I think what you see really in the trial of Socrates in Athens is this conflict between these two models of morality. And you really appreciate the vitality of Athens, because here you had a city that gave birth to a new positive principle that didn't just decline or corrode or everybody sort of become decadent and kind of whores and wine. But it actually, in its decline, it produced a new principle that would then take over. It's a battle not between Greeks and Persians, gods and giants. It's not between people of different natures. In the trial, it's very much the conflict of Athens with itself, and both sides recognizing the other as true. So I think in a way you can see in this trial really the validity of Hegelian dialectics, in the sense that something that is actually in the consciousness of participants themselves, that's normally, you have to construct it up the facts. So normally the new principle appears as a different kind of person, a different kind of people, a new conqueror or a resistance against an empire or something. Essentially, the old and the new appear from two very distinct parties, and they face each other as opposing enemies. Here you have the development of the new principle out of Athenian culture, and both sides recognise the validity of the other side. So I think it's in the fertility of Athenian culture that we see Hegelian dialectics very much on the surface of events, in the consciousness of participants. As a city gives birth to its new principle, which is at the same time its destruction, and all the while commenting on it, laughing about it, and reflecting on it.
Okay, who's got some thoughts? There's a couple of guys with microphones. If we get one of you to stay on this side, one of you to come over to the other side. If we start right at the back, please.
Josie, you indicated that he defied the law to affirm the law through his death. But there's, I presume you would agree, two meanings of the word law there as well, isn't there? I mean, he defies the letter of the law to affirm the spirit of the law, to affirm a greater, more transcendental, universal law that they had not discovered.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, can we come forward a bit? Yeah, great.
I'm not a philosopher or a historian, but I'm learning music just recently, and I just wonder whether Chris de Burgh, when he wrote Don't Pay the Ferryman, was a student of Socrates. And my other question is, Richard Feynman sort of changed my life when I saw him on television saying, "I'm not afraid of saying I don't know. It's the pleasure of finding things out." So that sounds a bit Socratic.
Josie, if you're not big on pop culture, we can request a
Yes,
rendition of the song later. Where we got to? Yeah, can we come up forward again?
Thanks a lot for that. That was really interesting. I think I'm vaguely sympathetic to the like Hegelian interpretation of like two clashing rights. I wonder though if we're in stressing that perhaps missing something really interesting and important about especially the death of Socrates and like the acceptance of the sentence and the realization that there's a sort of, and we could either side with you and Hegel and say that's like some residual acceptance of him of the sort of rightness of the sort of communal morality and the way that things were done in Athenian society. But can we not bring that more closely into what Socrates' life and philosophy represents, which is that he didn't, after all, he he wasn't the sort of Platonic philosopher turning away into becoming a philosopher king, turning away from the polis. Rather, he felt his activity of philosophy, as you mentioned earlier on in your lecture, as really quite intrinsic to being a philosopher, doing it in public, going around asking people. And like, it wouldn't have, all of his questions wouldn't have meant anything had there not been an underlying good being involved in being in the polis. And so, if we take that idea, we can perhaps explain why he accepts the sentence, because he accepts the polis as the foundation of the good life, and he can't conscience the idea of undermining that.
Okay, thank you. Can I just see who else wants to speak? Put your hand up if you want to speak. Yeah, okay. Yeah, lady in the second row. And then can we bring this mic up to the front here?
You said something about the accusers being right in the case of Socrates corrupting the youth. So, do you mean with that he shouldn't have been teaching his method without a new solution? Should he have waited without any new solution to after the rejection of the Athenian system? Should he have waited until he had an answer before teaching it to youth?
Yeah. And indeed that relates to the point then of your suggestion that Socrates was expressing a level of the individual conscience at a point when that individual conscience wasn't practicable as a means of social organisation. But the implication then of what you said is that at a later stage it could be or would be or might be, which we might want to explore a bit. Okay, yeah.
Thanks for the introduction, Jason. I thought it was really useful and sort of strikingly modern as well, the ideas that you were putting out there. But I was just trying to put word to this new principle that you were talking of. And I wondered if reversing the word order might help. Is the new principle moral individualism? Is that what is happening at that moment in time? Which isn't used bringing together of things, it's a custom of the individual. And that's why he has to accept the judgment as well, doesn't it? As the point was made earlier about in relation to the collective, he's still orienting himself. And you said that it couldn't survive. Why was it that it couldn't survive? Is that because of the absence of an advanced division of labour in society at that moment in time? That new principle, so he grasped the new principle and it's almost extinguished at the point at which it was articulated, but why was it extinguished?
Okay. Let me take 2 more points. Did you want to? Yeah.
Just a very quick question. About his acceptance of the sentence, the death sentence. So he welcomes the death sentence. And it seems to be more about the possibility of a more intimate relationship with the universal as kind of the ultimate aim of the philosopher. So I'd be interested if you could say anything about that.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, so this kind of idea of right being on both sides. I just wondered, in the principles that are kind of standing off against each other, the one that you didn't mention so much, but I think definitely comes out in the Izzy Stone reading, is Socrates, and actually Plato's, and to an extent Aristotle's, total hostility to democracy. And there's just to sort of, so one of the other things you didn't mention is comes off the back of the of Athenian democracy actually being completely undermined, taken over at the end of the Athens-Spartans War by Socrates' students. And so there is this, and so another way of looking at maybe the contradiction is actually between the individual will, which you gave a fantastic introduction to how Socrates is really establishing that as a new kind of moral centre, to the principle of democracy. And on the face of it, these two things, maybe to us, perhaps they seem like, it's not an irresolvable contradiction, but at least to the elite aristos and philosophers of in the early Socratic tradition, this seemed to be something that was completely irreconcilable.
Okay, Josie, do you want to come back on any of that?
Sure, yeah, no, very good points. I mean, I think that on that last point, I think Izzy Stone would have Socrates to be, an anti-democrat, an elitist, an aristocrat. So in some ways, he sees him mainly as, as a kind of throwback to pre-democratic kind of mores and that kind of thing, which is not the case. I think that there was a period where, in a way, the discovery of the individual meant to some extent a rejection of collective life as it existed at that time. Collective institutions. So he said, that you had to essentially being a private person was the way to go, and not actually as spending all your time in the assembly or in the law courts or in the public institutions, but actually in conversation. So I think that there was something about the necessity of rejecting democracy at that time, which is not just about being an aristocrat, and not just about basically being dismissive of the demos and everything like that. I think there's a way in which the discovery of the individual had to mean a defiance of a criticism of democracy. And I think in a later date you could return to a different kind of democracy, which includes individuality as individuals as independent interests, which didn't exist in Athenian democracy. Athenian democracy was a particular kind of democracy, which was very intense and very engaged, but individuals did not conceive of themselves as being separate interests. So I think that his defiance of democracy was not just like saying, oh, I'm an aristocrat, or Plato, I'm an aristocrat and against the people. It was kind of necessary at that point. And he wasn't bothering anyone. He wasn't like, in the sense he was sitting corners with 3 or 4 lads whispering, as was alleged. He was doing his own thing. And in his way, what he was pursuing was it was in the interpersonal sphere of civic life, in conversations, in the marketplace, in the gymnasium. It was in that space that he was performing what he saw as his civic task, not in the institutions of the assembly, which had very much their own rituals, their own restraints, and that kind of thing. So on the questions of whether he should have waited till he had the answer. I think the point I guess I was trying to make was that things had to happen as they did. There's a kind of necessity to the way that events occurred. And the thing about Socrates was he was before his time. So he proposed an idea before that could actually be put into practice. But that's the way it always happens. Every idea appears first in a form that is a raving, in terms of the heretics. They were bonkers. And yet, if you look at elements of what they're doing, it's the same thing as Luther. Essentially what they're saying is, conscience is about my relationship to God. Essentially it's a defiance of the authority of the church. But the form it takes at that time was bonkers. So there's a kind of, I think it's necessary that ideas appear in their first form in a way that is, it's either abstract, or it's negative, or it's a bit random. That's kind of how things appear for the first time. You can't do anything about that. Nothing is just born in kind of fully clothed garb. That's kind of what happens. So he had to put things forward in the way he did, but it was before its time, and therefore the trial had to find him guilty. I think that points where the individual is actually, so if you look at a Civil War hero, English Civil War hero like John Lilburne, who very much, similarly had a trial in which he defied the authority. He defied the authority of the Star Chamber as the source of political authority and right, and he said, I'm not going to take your oath, I'm going to defy you. But he was right for his time. The principle that he was proposing at that time could then be put into practice, and so he was not killed. There was a way in which he was able to win in a way that Socrates wasn't able to win. So I think what I'm really saying is that it was the principle of the future, but it was before its time. And therefore, yes, he had to teach it to the youth, but they, in a way, had to find him guilty because it was not yet full or capable of being the basis of social life. On Bill's point about defying the letter of the law to defy the spirit of the law, to respect the spirit of the law, I'm not sure about that. I kind of thought about it the opposite way, which is that he defied the content of the law and respected the form of it. So he basically said, I refuse to accept your judgment of me, but I'll go along with the sentence. You know, I'll respect the various formal principles of the court process. I accept the decision at the end of it, but I'm not going to accept the content of what you say about me. So there's a way in which he actually accepted the formalities of the legal process, because if you don't accept that, then you have disorder and barbarism. You know, you have someone who's a destroyer of laws. But he rejected the substance of the judgment. So I kind of thought about the opposite way, but I guess what you're saying is that, you know, at a later stage, his principle would become the law and would become the right and everything. And that's true, but at the stage he was at, it couldn't be.
But he rejects the content of their case whilst accepting the need for law and order.
Exactly, yeah. He rejects the content, but accepts the need that there must be laws, and there must be procedures. And if you actually look at the portrayals of Socrates with Plato and Xenophon, they're quite different. So Plato has him doing this kind of dialogue thing, very, you know, questioning what is truth, what is morality, just deconstructing it. Xenophon has him giving advice on how to be a good general, you know, how to treat your lover, you know, basically very, very practical advice. And you can see why Socrates had lots of friends, because if he were to carry on as Plato portrays him all the time, then, you know, really no one would want to hang around him at all. But there was a way in which what Plato described was probably an element of what he did. An element, you know, in a way it's the kind of a distillation of an element of his philosophy. It's not everything that he was, you know, which was very much more. He also gave practical advice on horsemanship and being a good general and everything, and that's why he had lots of friends, because he could also be quite useful as well as having this this kind of key critical philosophical method, which was revolutionary.
Okay. Let me see some hands. Kevin.
I noticed you didn't use you didn't use the term religion or religious sense in there at all, and I think that's kind of interesting. And I was going to ask you, when I read, if you look at Plato's Republic, it's a very, very sort of instrumentalist. There's no sort of universal overarching religious sense, and yet you're sort of imparting one to Socrates, and I just wonder whether you thought Socrates, with his sort of individual morality, was appealing to some sort of higher truth, some truth existing above humanity, which you seem to be implying, and whether that was a religious sense, and why isn't this taken into account by Plato in the Republic, where there's a really sort of instrumentalist sense of religion?
There was kind of a line of hands running back that side. Can I just see who had their hand up on this side again? Yeah, okay. In that case, can we go right to the back and then we'll come forward a bit? So, yeah, no, that's fine. Go there. That's fine if you're there. Okay, I'm going to take everyone, so. Yeah.
As a bunch of people who are relatively sympathetic to the claim, question everything, ban nothing, I just wonder why you stress the point that the jury was right. I would say, well, it's understandable the way the jury responded, but as we also discussed what is right and what is wrong, I just would like to know a bit clear. I didn't get why you think that they were right. I think they were understandable, but right, I would say, is another thing. Particularly if you think about the consequences for today, because sometimes I have the impression that people outside this room sometimes look at us and perceive us relatively as alien, as a lot of Greek people perceived Socrates. So I just want to know what you that claim, question everything, is actually a very modern one, and is saying the jury was right really the right response to it.
Can I have a show of hands of anyone else who thinks they're an alien? Let's go for that. Dennis says, and then we'll come forward.
I'm not quite convinced. I just think Socrates' death has obviously been one of the telling points of Western history, but I always took it more to do with knowledge. I mean, so Socrates, knowledge was virtue. So the question, can knowledge be taught? Can virtue be taught? The answer is yes, because it leads to knowledge. And what distinguished him from the sophists was, obviously, as you quite rightly said, was that he believed that knowledge was attainable. And certainly held to some values, like a good man cannot be harmed. One of the reasons why he accepted the death penalty. But how he's talking and arguing in a context where the sophists are also doing very similar things. So how that consciousness wasn't applied to the sophists as well as to Socrates? Would you say it wasn't? Socrates was writing at the same time as most popular. Well, you said that what was distinctive about him was not necessarily the pursuit of knowledge, which, you know, given the relativist nature of the times, and both for the pre-Socratics through to the sophists, that was quite an important thing to stick to. But some sort of consciousness, that's what you said, of consciousness of his individuality. And there are modern therapeutic interpretations of the Socratic Elenchus that actually emphasise those sort of things. So the question everything now becomes question everything, but you don't want any solutions. Just questioning is all it's about. So that's not the Socrates that I know. But he was writing at a time where there was Socrates very, very popular, defending freedom and decent practical life. So he's writing it in a state that is quite powerful. And the question I really don't understand is why you think that the state was even conscious of the fact that it was doing something wrong. And I thought they were very positive and very repressive times, which led to Plato's Republic, which was written in secret, essentially. So, you know, I'm not quite sure. I think you're downplaying the knowledge and overplaying a certain individual consciousness. So you actually could clarify that.
Okay, thank you. Can the mic come forward? Yeah, Bruno, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to go down a bit that same line, because I thought it was much more to do with what Socrates had done before he was sentenced to death. The idea that there is somebody who rejects the community is actually a picture which was quite well known, I would have thought, to the ancient Greeks from their mythology. So you had somebody like Antigone, who did a little bit the same thing, but it was very clear that she was doing the wrong thing at the time, because she'd gone against what was considered right. And there must have been a turning point prior to the actual trial, which made it seem, or at least made it very questionable what had been done to Socrates.
Yeah.
A couple of questions. First one was I couldn't see who the lady was.
Can you speak into the mic or switch on?
I couldn't see who the lady was at the front. Was it the lady in red? Could you explain what you mean by democracy, or what Athenian democracy was? Because I thought this kind of enthusiastic idea that you'd get together on a hillside and everyone would have a say and there'd be this huge argument. Whereas I get a feeling from what you're describing that democracy was, the individual was generally swamped by the needs of the society. Otherwise, I can't really see what was different between individuals in Athens as a democracy and Socrates. So, to clarify that. And the other question, it almost sounds like what you're describing is a kind of purified form of the emergence of individual will. Now, is that right? Or are we kind of abstracting from where we are and what we've become to find that in Socrates? In other words, was there something more peculiar and odd about what we were seeing there? I mean, I thought the introduction was fantastic. I think, all right, I understand Socrates now much better. But was it like that? Was it this purified emergence of consciousness, or was it much more warped and strange than that? Not just in the consequences, but in the thing itself.
Okay, yeah, you pass it. Bill, beside you. Yeah.
Well, feeling pessimistic now, because there's more than 2,000 years between Socrates, Milton, the Star Chamber, the Civil War, and it also suggests that ideas then aren't really much of a locomotive in history. It's really just material change that mattered, that created those conditions 2,000 years later. obviously we often get accused of knowing what's wrong with the world but not putting forward a positive program. So is it going to take 2,000 years?
Okay, and can you come forward to Piers Ben?
Thanks for a brilliant introduction. On this bit of Socrates deciding not to escape his punishment, where this comes out to the fore, I think, is in the subsequent dialogue with Crito, when Crito, his friend, is visiting in prison, tries to persuade Socrates that he can actually get him off. He's got some friends, he can arrange for it. He can bribe a jailer and tell him quite big to get him out. And Socrates refuses to do so because he says that that would be defying the laws of Athens, to which he owes his education. Now that's very, I think, a very sort of profound and pivotal moment in sort of legal or political history in a way. And I just wonder what your own views are about that kind of radical attitude towards not revolting against an unjust conviction when in fact you're able to do so. Because hardly anybody nowadays would say that you should actually offer yourself the punishment when you know perfectly well you've been unjustly punished, but according to just laws. And I just wonder if you think there are any lessons in this. For example, I don't see Amanda Knox going back to Italy voluntarily for this trial because although she might be innocent, I don't know whether she or not, the court established she did anything again. You just wouldn't see anybody contemplating such a thing in this day and age.
I think she did it. Yeah. Bruno? Yeah.
Well, presumably one of the reasons she wouldn't go back is because it's a foreign court. I don't think Socrates would have submitted to a foreign city judging him, so he allowed himself to be judged because it was his policies, his city. But what I'm interested in is this. You were saying, Josie, it was a brilliant introduction. You were saying that it is of necessity that new principles and new ideas are impossible, but of necessity they're impossible. Yet, if you look at Socrates and the form it took the form of conversation, it took the form of public life, of discourse. It might have been outside the traditional mechanisms of Athenian democracy, but it was part of the public life of the city, the form that it took, the way in which it emerged, the kind of person that he was. He was a public person, so presumably the principle wasn't so new that it was alien to the life of the city and the public, otherwise it presumably could not have taken that form. And so would it then be the case that the decline of Athens is because while it was pregnant with this new principle, a new idea in the form of Socrates, it was unable to give birth to it. So then can't we be judgmental and not go a bit beyond by saying both sides were right to look at the problem of when a new principle that is given birth by that society and a leading member of it comes up against the limitations of that society? Surely then, there should have been some kind of revolution or expansion of the notion of the public and the public space in Athenian society. And was that not also perhaps a limitation of Socrates as well in allowing himself to be judged like that?
Okay, Josie, do you want to come back on something?
Gosh. Yeah, I mean, on that, I mean, I think that it couldn't have happened because actually, if it was his method is pregnant with a new insight, but it's in a form that can't actually be realised, and it's not due to the inflexibility of Athens or his weakness of will, but actually, he doesn't get to his universal definition, and actually, it is a bit of a fool's errand. The idea that out of purely cerebral reasoning, one can come up with a definition of such clarity and consistency and universality that one can then orientate one's conduct towards that. That's just not true. That's not real. And in a way, he was coming up with a new principle, but in too extreme a form. He was rejecting too definitively actually elements of truth, of reality. and there isn't a way in which it was doomed to fail. And I think we don't have to, I mean, sorry for bringing the Civil War. I mean, really in Aristotle you see that I mean, in the lecture this morning, and the nuances that are available in Aristotle, you know, in a way, only 3 generations later, the kind of productiveness of Socrates' thinking had already been integrated into a system that was much more nuanced and much more concrete. And Izzy Stone kind of wants to have Aristotle without having Socrates. He kind of says, oh look, Aristotle is so much more concrete, you know, he's so much more, he recognises the value of laws, and he wants to know what people think, not just to deny that, but actually to see what's true in that. You know, Aristotle says, he gives account of what people think, because there's got to be something in it. But the point is that Aristotle contains Socrates within him, in the sense that he is looking at what people think, and the kind of mores and customs, not to be overwhelmed by them, not to be swamped by them, but to be a critical individual outside of them. So, you know, in that short space of time, actually, the insights of the truth on the side of the jury and on the side of Socrates had been integrated into you know, a much fuller understanding. You know, and Socrates, for example, his rejection of emotion and intuition. Everything is about cerebral reasoning. That's all that exists. You know, you see very much later with an idea of conscience, the heart being returned, and the importance of actually of what one feels about something. You know, and that being a guide just as much as the reasoning process. So I think that it was, as had to happen, it was a realization of a new principle that was in an extreme form that rejected too definitively things that had gone before. But only 3 generations later, you had actually a kind of synthesis of both sides in that court battle, such that actually the truth of both could be incorporated. I know this is to some extent goes against the sympathies we might have, and the kind of, you know, I'm obviously a civil liberties campaigner, so I'm very much for questioning everything, obviously against prosecutions for what you say, etc. I guess for me, the important point is to take a side in the battles of one's own time, and not in the battles of history. You know, it's a long time ago, and in a way, what was one served by writing a defense speech for Socrates, or saying, or fighting that battle? You know, in a way, it becomes about the battles of our time, and what we do in history when we're looking at history is not to take sides, which in a way is to justify one's own position. You know, to kind of cheer on one side or another, but to understand the course of things. And so, you know, to understand in a way the development of human understanding, with its events taking a kind of necessary course, which we're the product of that. And yes, we take battles in our own. We take sides in the battles of our own times, not, for me, not in the battles of the past. I think the point about Stuart's question about Athenian democracy, what's the difference? I mean, I think, you know, essentially it's a form of democracy where individuals don't have any sense of their separation from the city, from communal life. They don't have an idea of themselves as having separate interests, as being apart from that life. And so it's a different form of democracy to that which appears later. But in a way, the later form is only because, you know, you had individuals rejecting those kind of civic forums, and kind of, you know, Socrates is taking things apart. Other individuals later, they went off on their own. You know, Descartes went in his oven and decided to, you know, find truth by himself in isolation. You know, so I think that the kind of developed form of democracy requires the kind of rejection of that, and it means that you actually end up with something quite different to the kind of form that it took at the time. Sure, yeah.
Right up to the point.
Okay, yeah. Can we bring the mic? Where are the mics? Who's got the mic? Is there one near the front? Can you come right to the front? Here, yeah. And then, are there any hands on my left, the right-hand side of the room as you sit? We'll bring this other one to the front as well, please. And then we'll work our way back again. And then I'll ask Josie to kind of round up the discussion before we'll move off into little groups and interrupt you in the bar. Come.
Josie, what I took from your talk, which was very good and excellent, was that Socrates was a bad boy through his critical thinking, critical questioning, and he pushed Daddy's state to its limit, and then Daddy's state took him to court, and then they rejected him and wanted to kill him. Socrates then, through his rejection of the state, he finally agreed with them, and then he committed suicide in a sense, and rejected the rejecter within himself. So, did the state murder Socrates, or did Socrates commit suicide?
Okay.
Thank you, Josie. My question, glad you said that bit about it not being all about the head, and you can't sort of derive praxis or phrases just from an intellectual process alone. It got me thinking, I think it was in something Arendt wrote, where she said that if Socrates hadn't killed himself, we wouldn't even remember him, he would have no meaning today. And so that got me thinking, well, surely it doesn't mean just anybody that kind of kills themselves or is executed merits to be remembered throughout history. So I'd really like to know what your take is on the connection between, if you like, ideas and the force that an idea can have to compel or provoke an action. And somewhere, obviously, the question of truth must be in that, and maybe the location of that, and the fact that Socrates really was locating that within a civic sphere within humanity was perhaps the radical threat that was sensed.
Great, thank you. And you pass that just across the aisle. Yeah.
So I think, as brilliant as I thought the introduction was, I keep thinking that maybe we could stand it on its head a little bit. Because one thing, I mean, somebody will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think it's only about 200 years, or maybe even less than that there's been a democracy in Athens, right? And it's come off the back of the Greek Dark Ages, when there's been no writing for hundreds of years. And so all these institutions are all newly minted, and they're all still being, worked out, really. And I think there's a good argument that Socrates is actually the production of exactly these institutions and exactly the democracy. So there's a way in which the public institutions have made Socrates, which now he's turned around and done something new with. So, and then of course, it is the fact, which I briefly mentioned, that his students actually did overthrow the democracy not 20 years before. And then they were given, they did a deal so they couldn't be convicted. So there's a sense in which, I think it was well understood, at least rightly or wrongly, by his contemporaries, that he was a threat to the democracy. So I just wondered, are we perhaps just loading too much onto Socrates as an individual and sort of giving a bit of a one-dimensional picture of Athenian democracy to make him, big him up, if you like?
Okay, that's interesting. And I mean, maybe also, this may sound odd, but does that matter? I mean, I'm not trying to undercut what you're saying, but does it matter if the Socrates that we've got isn't exactly who Socrates?
I think we definitely haven't got the original, but I mean, maybe it doesn't matter that much. But
it
is quite interesting to dig behind it a little bit. Otherwise, the Athenians just look, it just looks like they're, it turns the Democrats into villains, which I'm not really sure that's the right way to look at them.
Okay. This guy here. Can I also just see who else wants to speak? There are a few more hands a minute ago. Okay, so let's get this mic if we can. Somebody can run it round over here, please. And then, yeah.
I was just going to ask whether we can question if this is actually the birth of individual morality or just an example of inauthentic morality, because he comes up with something different in the sense that what he considers to be right or wrong is different to the city. But when he accepts that he's guilty according to the laws of Athens, even though he disagrees with the subject and the content of the laws, he's accepting that he's a subject to those laws, that he has a responsibility. And so from a normative perspective, he's accepting that he ought to do this or that. And so actually drinking the poison and not escaping he's actually just being very inauthentic with his own morality and tacitly accepting the cities, even though he disagrees with it. I just wondering what you thought.
That's interesting. I just wondered in relation to what Josie had said earlier, if it's not perhaps that he's being inauthentic with himself, but actually that the absence of his positive criticism, of his positive challenge, of his solution, actually means that even though he has been the critic who negates the city, he is also, and at the same time, nothing but a product and a citizen of Athens and cannot be any different. And that's actually what's represented in him ultimately accepting not the process of the court, but its final conclusion against him. He cannot be anything outside of Athens. That is all there is to be.
But then, would it be individual morality then? Would it be something cultural rather than his own thinking?
Interesting. I don't know. Okay. Yeah, you got the mic? Yeah, there we go.
Thanks. Alcus, I think it was, said something about the trial. Without the trial and the death, we wouldn't know anything of Socrates. Another way of looking at that is age. In one of his first justifications for accepting the verdict, I think, he throws it out almost flippantly, is that he's quite old, and he's had a good life, and then he goes on to the more principled reasons. But I wonder if that's an evasion, because if it had happened, if the same trial had happened at the beginning of his life, we wouldn't know about him either, because he wouldn't have had a chance to do what he did. So is that an evasion on his part? Is there something in terms of the compromises and so on we need to do to get our ideas across that he missed?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, do you want to bring the mic forward? And can I just see, before I'm going to bring Josie in to kind of, not close the discussion down, but round things off for a bit. So can I just see who else wants to, yeah. Okay, yeah.
Can't you look at Socrates also as the birth of a new authoritarian morality? Because if Plato succeeded Socrates, isn't it the idea of the universal forms and the idea that the non-philosopher cannot understand the universal and is essentially ignorant was the basis of the Platonic sort of authoritarian morality?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, and then this guy here, where's the mic on this side? Yeah, behind you and to my right, to your right now, that way you're facing. There we go. Thank you.
Just to answer the question I think that came up at the front, and to reiterate something that Piers raised earlier, it's important to recognise that in accepting his penalty, he is making a very nuanced individual judgment about his own circumstances. So that is an assertion of a very complex individual morality, because he's recognising that he as an individual, as Piers said, owes a lot to the laws of Athens, and he personifies the laws and says, well, how would I explain myself to the laws if they were to say, Socrates, we've done all this for you, and now you are exposing us to being fundamentally undermined. And so obviously that leads him to a very complex and nuanced approach to his own trial and his own fate. So I don't think there's anything contradictory in saying that he submits himself eventually. He's not submitting wholeheartedly to the community's morality. What he's doing is he's accepting as an individual he owes a debt and it has to be paid.
Josie.
No, I think that's right, and so I wouldn't see it as being inauthentic or some kind of way in which he sold his principles ultimately. In fact, he went along with the judgment, but more, as Luke said, a nuance, an awareness of a complexity in the world, which is to say, yes, I can stand here and defy you, but on the other hand, there can be no society without laws, and I am part of the city just as I defy it. And I think that Socrates, not to overstate the importance of those ideas, or to see him as on his own and completely revolutionising thought aside from Athens. He very much represents and crystallises out a development that was happening within Athenian society. So when I talked about the balance that existed in the kind of high point of Athens between individuals pursuing collective goals, so, writing artworks, fighting bravely, gymnastics competitions. He represents the weakening of one side of that balance. So he represents the weakening of those social forms of customary morality through a growing individualism, through development of market forces, development of the empire, development of travel, all those sorts of the very concrete things that were happening that were changing that society. And so in a way he gives voice to essentially a growing individualization that was happening in a kind of concrete way through people's relationships to one another. The very real corrosion of the city-state as it was existing. But Hegel basically says the thing about Athens was that it produced something out of that corrosion, whereas Sparta just got, and you could say Rome in a way, just got vain and selfish, and lots of decadent individuals, kind of whores and wine and that sort of thing. So in a way, he represents a real social change that is happening within Greek society, growing individualism, and just kind of crystallizes that out as an idea which is positive and which is in some way the future. The question about what evidence was there that the court went back on its judgment. I mean, one of the main kind of accounts we have on the lives of philosophers is the one who says essentially that they later put up a statue to Socrates and convicted his accusers and that sort of thing. Now, that may or may not be true, because he's a very kind of gossipy kind of chap who recorded this. But in substance, the openness and the debate about whether they'd done the right thing carried on. So there wasn't a way in which everybody thought, yes, we've done the absolute right thing, he's gone, that's over. He says, if you kill me, then the principles that I represent will continue in a greater form, in a far greater form. And that was true. That it's not that you can put it back in the bottle after that's occurred. So, and that was very much within Athens, people carried on writing defence speeches for him. It was a source of public debate. So whether or not they put a statue up to him, it's quite unlikely in certain ways. There was a way in which the Athens revoked the judgment and said that actually we're not so sure that he was guilty in the way that we decided and thought. The question of whether Socrates just agreed to kill himself because he was old, and that's kind of what Xenophon says, that he'd had a good life and actually was a bit tired of it and he wanted to die in his prime and that sort of thing. It could be the case, but I think that more I would take the statement from Socrates saying, all my life I've been preparing my defence, which is to say that the trial, the points are more made about if he hadn't died in this way, would we remember him? In a way, it was just a dramatic dramatisation of the principle, which is that he stood there and defied the court. In a way, he was able to put into practice a principle that he'd been, discussing in the corners and the back streets and the marketplaces. If it had just been that he'd spent his whole life whispering in a corner with 3 or 4 boys, what would have come of that? And so the trial, in a way, was the point at which he could put into action the principle and to display it, as a play almost, as a kind of as a drama. And so the trial is, in a way, the point at which what he's doing is actually realised and given some value, and given a kind of concrete existence in the world. And so that's why, in a way, that's why he's remembered for that, and rightly so. So yes, I very much, I agree with Bruno's point about what Socrates was doing was not completely hostile to Athens. He won an enormous number of followers. All the youth thought he was absolutely fantastic and went around kind of imitating his method, and he had these sort of adoring followers. In a way, his dependence upon the conversation in public is also a sign of the incompleteness of the form that his individual morality is taking, in the sense that he needs to be part of that conversation to be anything. In a way, he needs the other person to say, this is what I think, for him to be able to knock it down. So there's a kind of way in which him spending his whole life in the public sphere, as Xenophon said, always in the sight of others, in a way that's a sign of his lack of genuine independence. he needed others in order to think. You know, he brought forth nothing himself. He pricked others to consciousness. So there's a kind of way in which you could see that's a sign of his dependence upon the morals of the day in order to be able to negate them. So in a way, the first form that the individual appears is basically is very much in civic life and not apart from it. And it takes the form of the rejection of what most people think. So later, that individual would go off and they would actually reflect for themselves. You know, they would have a genuine sphere of partners from that public world. But with Socrates, it's very much at the stage of still being immersed in that public world and not being nothing apart from it. But very much the critical moment against that public world. So talking to people in order to take apart what they say. But again, you know, it had to take place in that form. You can't kind of, you know, I guess for me the lessons would be, you know, in terms of deciding what we think about this episode would be, first of all, you know, not to take sides in the conflict, but trying to understand it, and then not to wish that someone could get to the end where they'd only just started. So I think that one has to kind of see the emergence of new ideas as having a certain necessity, and of necessity taking an incomplete or a nascent form, which is later in the course of history, in the course of time, is filled out in its concreteness. But you can't have Aristotle without Socrates, and you can't you know, Stone kind of wants to have Aristotle without Socrates, and you can't do that. You can't jump. So those would be the two lessons that I would sort of take from it.
Whether or not you all feel stung as if by a stingfish, and whether or not that was necessary. Can we thank Josie for guiding us through? We now have about an hour for coffee, and you've probably got about a minute to get to the front of the queues in each of the coffee machines before the other sessions come out. So go and drink coffee. Thanks a lot.